Thank you very much, Diane Gordon, for all the rights and the rewrites and the reading today. Thank you very much, William Boyd, for all your effort and all these rehearsals you guys have been through. So we'll launch in here a little bit, this little epilogue. We can only adapt to the world we're born into. When I was 7 and Tony was 2, I arrived home one day to see a beer bottle thrown through the front window and a police car parked outside. 2 years before that, our father was killed in a plane crash. Over the next 20 years, the police were at the door many times, but charges were never laid against the stepfather. There were no shelters for women and children at the time. Everyone in the house was trapped. As he got older, Tony's only relief was alcohol and hiding in the woods. No matter what happened, he could hide in the woods. Something called schizophrenia struck at about 17. We, the family, of course, had no idea why he had become so strange. He just would not listen to our instructions about how to get along. We, of course, were all floundering ourselves. So it was the woods for Tony. He gradually shaped a little life for himself in the streets of Trenton. One of the things he would occasionally pull was to get a little drunk, find a bar with a piano. He would play random notes that were lyrical enough to garner him tips and beer from the audience. I came to learn there are people who are also desperate, who will steal from and hurt street people. I call this charming little group a predator culture. When I was 10 and Tony was 5, I could not catch him. When we were running around in the yards and so on, he was the fastest human being I had ever met. Man, oh man, he could run. So he ran away from minimum security prison, and he went to medium security. Most people get time off for good behavior, but he refused to work in the prison. The other cons weren't too happy either. Tony represented refusal while they did what they were told. When I would visit him in the open visiting rooms, it was obvious that most of these guys were young and muscled up. Not a bunch you want to piss off too much. After he'd get out, he wouldn't even steal an apple from a farmer's tree. He would look for wild apple trees. Almost every person I ever spoke to about Tony said something like, "Of course he's on medication." I assured them Tony had a motto: "I don't take any drugs that are legal." Schizophrenia, a psychiatrist knew Tony wouldn't touch the usual schizophrenia meds, so prescribed him a mild sleeping pill and a mild stimulant for the morning. This was an attempt to stimulate or to regulate sleep patterns. I was sure he would take a bunch at a time to get high or low or seldom. A couple of months later, he still had the unopened containers. I know, alcohol is a legal drug, but we were surrounded by alcohol culture. It was the pharmaceuticals he wouldn't touch. Tony's nephew said that none of the schizophrenia drugs are for sale on the streets. Nobody wants them. As it turns out, there's plenty of research to show that people who are diagnosed schizophrenic and take a placebo or no meds do much better over a 5-year span than medicated people. For example, the work of Martin Harrow and Robert Whitaker then even indicate the more meds used, the worse the long-term outcome. We, of course, know nothing about this research, but Tony somehow knew what to do. Don't take the drugs. Tony and I both like to keep a low profile around people, especially around the stepfather. But we had a feisty sister. She was born to battle. At about 12, Carol, avoiding the family nightmare, stayed away from home for 2 nights within a 30-day span. With no previous charges, she was charged with being incorrigible. The judge told her, this child, without a lawyer, she could be sent to juvenile prison for an indeterminate, possible 6-year stretch, depending on her behavior. Of course, her response was, "You wouldn't dare." And of course, the judge dared. Tony and I got the message. Get even quieter. We were kind of like Gabor Mate's hungry ghosts. I managed to learn enough social skills to make a living. The The cabin building process allowed both of us to do something meaningful and enrich our presence on the planet. He was enriched by shelter and meaningful input into the direction of his life instead of hiding from predators. I was enriched by partially solving the imminent, premature death of another family member due to neglect. The cabin avoided the dangerous dance of winter. The social worker said over and over he was too needy for services available and then cut him off welfare for not doing a job search. Job search, he was catatonic. This meant being cut off was to go to the woods in the winter. The day the roof went on the cabin was the last day he chose to sleep in the woods. A little more about the dogs. When the first Great Luxury arrived, Tony got to pick a dog at the pound. Over the years, he had several dogs. He knew I was of the leftish persuasion. I had taken him to several used bookstores to help him pass the long winters. He bought some Russian novels. All his dogs were named after Russians, like Pushkin and Rubin. Went one time and there he was, had some plants growing in little pots from seed. I asked him what that was about. He said he was going to grow his own apple trees. I had to tell him that when you take seeds from an apple, plant it in the ground, the tree will grow, but you won't produce a tree that'll have apples. He said, well, I'll just grow them for the blossoms. In the early days at the cabin, we managed to get all the local family members to Tony's place to celebrate his new life and home. This was his first gathering in his name in his life. He threw an orange peel on the ground in the middle of 44 acres of bush. The most patronizing of the women ordered him to pick it up. He said no. The tone was set. This was his space. We had several other gatherings there. Well-meaning people brought curtains that matched the dishcloths. He needed to see out to view the bears or skunks, not privacy. He was 600 feet from the road. He liked to see the deer, the foxes, the wild turkeys. During visits, he was proud to take us on trails he cut through the bush. The old logging road north of his place gradually became overgrown, and he would not open it up again. He gradually became more vocal, a little less demanding, more willing to reach out to people. He was finding within himself the motive and ability to improve his social skills. During his 18 years at the cabin, he was occasionally taken advantage of, fell in love with the wrong woman, made mistakes with credit, became arrogant about some issues. But who hasn't made the same troublesome choices? However, he was never physically beaten, never robbed, never involved in a petty crime, never went without food, never slept outside again. He always had the company of his dogs. He made meaningful additions to his cabin and took care of the land to the best of his ability and had a small social support network. I guess it was worth the effort.
Hi.
Hey,
And you are?
I'm John Lewis. Tony's Cabin, the play, is about Tony Lewis's cabin in the woods north of Highway 7,
And,
halfway to Bancroft.
and what's so important about Tony's cabin in the woods?
Well, because there was no model that fit for him to get services in a small town, Trenton, Belleville, and his needs were extraordinary in the sense of, the literature that I used to read a little bit about, not a lot, but a little bit, was that the best outcomes were people who had the most amount of family support, and everybody jumped in, and they had a nice clean place, and nobody else in the house was an addict, and all this kind of stuff.
And what was Tony's problem that needed him, that you said he needed special support and services?
Well, at what stage in his life, sorry?
Well, just generally. you know, you were talking about getting services and having family support.
Well,
Why did he particularly need those things?
Because at the point where he was struck by something, if you read it carefully, the literature, no one really gets what schizophrenia is. That's just
So he
a
was
label.
schizophrenic.
Yeah. It's a hang-all thing. If nothing else fits, they kind of put you in the schizophrenic range. There's no specific blood test. They don't seem to really have a good handhold on a definition for it. But if you have these symptoms, then they'll do that. And he had all the basic classic symptoms, so he fit that basic paradigm. But at the time, and somewhat still, the best outcomes almost always are for people who come from the most ordinary, stable households. People care about each other. There's enough family resources. There isn't massive. The resources aren't built on massive amounts of debt, and there's no other addicts in the house. There's everybody enjoys each other, and everybody wants to contribute to the person's recovery. And in Tony's case, there was nobody wanted to contribute to his recovery. Nobody wanted to find out anything about what this was about. They more or less just shunned him.
But you did.
I did what?
You wanted to help him.
Well, the code of the road, we were pretty rough and tumble characters. The code of the road was, you help people out, but you don't fix their lives for them. That was their burden to bear for themselves. And all of that went on and on and on, and I could still be mostly his brother, and help him out when I could. But at some point or other, he entered a kind of a downward spiral where things just got worse and worse and worse. There was no signs of grow up, get over it. He that wasn't going to happen. So something had to change, and I decided to gradually make a difference somehow in his life, to do the things that he couldn't do for himself. When your choice of self-medication, self-direction in your life is to isolate yourself from everybody, in medical terms, there's side effects. You don't get to develop social skills. You don't get to build social networks. You don't get to have all kinds of things that we all take for granted, all the benefits of being in group, in culture, and he didn't have any of that. He's like 24 hours a day all by himself, listening to his own brain stuff rattling around, instead of most of us to some degree. We were talking about this the other day. We've heard voices and so on. We learned to kind of figure out some way to A, quiet them down, and B, do something meaningful, and then the brain's got action, right? It's got activity, useful work, useful activity, interesting work, interesting activity. Well, he didn't have any of that, so he just kept kind of coming apart,
How did he stay together and stay alive as long as he did?
I don't know. Those are the great secrets of the street people. I mean, one of them you talk about a little bit in the play was what to eat, what not to eat, what to drink. Don't drink hot liquids in the winter because it'll just warm you up, and then you sweat a little bit and you're worse. And don't move around too much, because then you sweat a little bit and then it's worse. I mean, and I think Inuit culture does the same thing. They only work till they start to sweat, and then they'll stop because they know better. And Tony knew all that stuff somehow or other, and I mean, I see them in the cities, homeless people sleeping out in very cold nights, but he was in the woods, long, long ways from any kind of social services or anything. So it was that kind of thing. There was just no services available, and something had to be done that was different than what was was obvious. You could see each month, each year, he was sinking further and further into a kind of a downward spiral till, one of the things I used to worry about is that he would make a mistake, and a mistake would be getting drunk on a really cold night, and he wouldn't, sort out his details about what body position, however it is he solved all of that, staying out in that kind of weather. And who would blame him? I mean, if I had that little going on in my life, I'd like to be drunk. every day, all day, and he couldn't afford to do that. He couldn't afford to become an addict. He couldn't afford the drugs. So he went long stretches without any relief from anything.
And what age was he when you finally decided that you had to find him someplace to live that was safe?
I think he was pretty close to 30. So he had a long run of, fix it yourself. There was no fixing this himself. There was no, and then the more involved I got, the more I realized there were no services. There was just these social workers coming in to cut people off welfare. And we're about to go through a whole new round of it in this province with the impending changes to ODSP and changes to, we'll see what this government wants to do. But it's awful, awful, all over Britain, all over Greece, all over parts of Europe. People are going through the same thing. They're just being dumped out of these services and left without that basic structure that they need. And it's potentially coming to Ontario now. But in those days, at least there was that. You think about somebody somewhere had at least some sense about this stuff, and they put in some legislation that was better than welfare.
Okay, but you didn't know about that.
No, I didn't know anything about it.
Time. He was 30 when you kind of figured you'd start hoping to solve the problem with some kind of housing. It took a long time for you to find ODSP, which is what was essential.
Which was insane.
Yeah.
I don't know how many conversations I had with social workers trying to facilitate getting him. Why wouldn't they just say, why don't you apply for ODSP? I mean, nothing.
Yeah.
Not a word. Never heard of it.
Why do you think that was?
I have no idea. I think that anyway, I'd have to speculate into the minds of a social worker, and I know I've met a few social workers at that, the kind that does this point of contact with people who are just desperate for money. And they're decent people, but they got caseloads of hundreds and hundreds of people. They don't have any time. They can't go back and battle with their boss over all of these things. I mean, I don't know exactly the details of what that went through, but I know the drill was always the same. You either do the job searches or you get cut off. And then after a while you do the job searches, well, why aren't you being successful? And get cut off. Whatever that mechanism was, you couldn't stay on it for very long. And it sure wouldn't pay for a room and food, even if you were on it for a little bit.
Once he was established in the log cabin, what were your expectations of him in terms of the rest of his life? What did you hope would happen for him?
I didn't have any expectations formulated. I knew what I was just so happy about was that he got away from the predator culture. Mm-hmm. I mean, he was getting this ODSP, and they were getting most of it. So it was, to me, it was insanity, and getting beat up regularly. And then even though he had ODSP, he had a room paid for, he was still going to the woods because they'd go to the room to find him. And so how can you break this chain? So that was what had to happen. I started looking at properties just outside of town. No, they'll walk out there. And Tony knew it too. So we started going to the further and further away, and then that was the first expectation, to break that cycle. And the next one was, let's see what happens. And it was the early days, at least for me, of the sustainability movement in North America. Some people beginning to think about the way they harvested lumber, the way they gardened, the way they, organic foods and all that kind of stuff. So I was hoping he would pick up that a little bit. None of which took for him very well. Partly the soil was no good for growing and so on and so on. But just the same, the main thing, and the most surprising thing was the benefit of the dogs. Mm. It's just such a difference to somebody. I know I've seen them in Toronto occasionally, street people who manage to maintain a dog, but most can't. And that was a great thing for him, you know, to be able to have those dogs. You just see him, he just beamed. People would be visiting, and all of a sudden there'd be a certain amount of fractiousness because of, it wasn't ugly, but it was, well, why don't you do this, Tony? Why don't you do that, Tony? And of course, he didn't have a clue, not a clue. Never bothered to find out what life for a homeless person was. But he just, you know, start stroking his dog and talking to his dog and shut them out.
Can you talk a little bit about the whole Canadian Tire adventure and how that impacted on his life? What changes that made to him being able to go out and get shiny stuff? We know what the downside was, but what was the attraction there?
Well, it wasn't an attraction I was happy to see, but because I had thought, you know, at some point, well, at least he's not caught up in consumer culture. But I watched him occasionally from afar, and he just beamed when he pulled that card out. You know, and on the upside though, I was, you know, he was identifying with general culture, whereas before nobody could be approachable. Now he was aspiring to be one of general culture, but like all the rest of us, not all the rest of us, but people who are reasonably alienated, they're really only functional in a sense when they're in a store. You know, when their contact with the world is to spend money. And if they don't have money, they don't have much time connecting with the world, and which is awful and all that kind of stuff. But he at least enjoyed that part of it, and he never understood, and this is partly because of, I don't know what all it was. Anyway, I'm not going to speculate anymore about that, but he couldn't understand compound interest. Maybe he was, I will say, if you're going to speculate on something, he was too morally ethical to understand this nefarious process. He couldn't believe it was happening. He just didn't believe it. And when you crunch the numbers and put the numbers right out for him, he wouldn't look at them. All he knew was it was you know, immediacy. He wanted something, and he could just put that card out there, and he had it. And in his earlier days, I know this was a real barrier to trying to transition him from one kind of worldview to another. If your life is in like 5-minute chunks, I either make the right decision in the next 5 minutes, i.e. flee from Bob, flee from the cops, flee from this, go to the right place to hide, go to the right place to get a drink. If I make any errors on that, my life could be over. You know, people live right on that precipice. And so that followed him along, where he didn't kind of have this thing. People make decisions, and then they get to I make this up, hopeless stereotyping, but you walk around and you go, well, I'd like to get a beer. And you get to the door of certain beer parlors and you just say, nope, not going in there. I'm backing out of here. Whereas he would, no matter how awful it looked, if it had what he wanted in there, that's where he would go. He had no practice at longer term thinking about where this might go.
Did you see any signs of that when he was younger? I mean, was the change at the age of 17? Did you have any kind of inkling, as you look back, of those things happening in his life?
No, he was very different from me, and this is not unusual, but he had so many obvious talents that the rest of us, like, were just in awe of. You know, this business about the running.
Mm-hmm.
We had a driveway that sloped up pretty steeply. He'd walk up that driveway on his hands.
Mm-hmm.
Not down the driveway, up the driveway. He immediately learned how to ski. He was in a couple of rock and roll bands in the early 60s. And he played drums, yeah, and was very popular with girls. I don't know, there was just all kinds of things that he did just so well. And none of the rest of us were any good at anything, you know, we're just getting by. So we had reasonable respect and awe for the guy, but we didn't see any of that other kind of stuff. And then little stories were leaking out here and there as time went on about how difficult he was to be around sometimes. And anyway, yeah.
And one last question. Why do you think this is an important story to tell?
Well, because it's what the little bit of literature that I have studied, and I've had some contact with what used to be called the Friends of Schizophrenics. None of this is on their agenda. None of it. None of this business about, you know, getting a shelter for somebody, not taking the meds especially. All of that stuff is off the radar for almost anything I've ever heard. These two researchers that I've referred to in there, that work is fairly new to me. There's been lots of stuff go on. I don't understand why this isn't more generalized around. But I did no intention, no desire to try and make a huge amount of effort to understand schizophrenia. My job was to understand how to get Tony to see the benefits of staying alive. That was it. The rest of it didn't matter. All that other paraphernalia, it wasn't doing him one bit of good.
And housing was essential to that.
Yeah, and you know, the world, there's lots of movements around now, and they're understanding that I mean, to be overly thing, there was a study done, I think, in Seattle, and they followed certain homeless people, and they figured it out. Some of them over a lifetime, were costing $1 million to take care of, between the accidents and the hospitals and the hospitalizations and prisons. And if they spent $50,000 on a livable unit in a building per housing, all of that other expense went away. The first thing is to have safe shelter and a secure income for food. Once that happens, then people are not living on this, you know, kind of like wild animal right on the edge of, I'm going to starve to death if I don't figure something out, and I'm going to freeze to death, or somebody's going to kick the life out of me in the middle of the night for my knapsack, right? The main thing was, and I asked Tony one time, I said, if you were designing a unit for schizophrenics, a housing unit, what would you recommend? And because they hear so much, the reports are that they hear voices in their head and they're blah, blah, blah. And Tony reported having some of the same. He said, because other noises interfere with their capacity to, you know, they already have diminished capacity to run their own brains when the voices get to them. So he said, build the rooms with extreme sound insulation for schizophrenics, so that when they go in that room, they can figure it out, okay, this is my own wheels rolling, not stuff leaking in through the doors and the windows and all that kind of stuff, you know, other noises confusing the issues. I found that to be quite interesting, and maybe somebody would care about that. But the main thing is, for almost anybody who's homeless, is a secure place to live, secure funding for food, and then see what happens.
Thank you.